Do we live in a market economy? Why should politicians stay away from monetary policy? And why is the chicken a good mascot for free markets? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of eConception. eConception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from a chicken coop on the outskirts of Lima, Peru, so we apologize in advance for any sound quality issues. Our guest today is Daniel Hannan. He is a member of the House of Lords in the UK. In addition to that, famous as a member of European Parliament back when that was still a thing that the UK was a part of. He was a big part of getting them out of that, and also is an advocate for free trade and free markets around the world. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It's great to be here, Dominic.
And I brought you on today to talk about a topic that might be unusual, which is chicken. You have a theory about chicken and its role in the free market movement. The eagle was chosen as sort of the national mascot of the United States at the founding. There's an old rumor that Benjamin Franklin wanted it to be the turkey instead. You suggest, though, that the chicken is actually the bird of choice.
Quite. I mean, actually, by the way, more than a rumor about Ben Franklin. In 1784, he wrote the following: "For my own part, I wish the bald eagle had not been chosen the representative of our country. It is a bird of bad moral character. Besides, a rank coward, the little kingbird, not bigger than a sparrow, attacks him boldly and drives him out of the district. He is therefore by no means a proper emblem for the brave and honest Cincinnati of America, who've driven all the kingbirds from our country." Now, Ben Franklin, as you correctly suggest, really wanted the turkey, which kind of makes sense, right? I get that. The turkey, I think, is still found wild in every state except Alaska and so on. So, okay. Leaving turkeys aside, the chicken is the ultimate symbol of the liberty movement. And I mean that in a very practical way, first of all. Almost every free market organization, think tank, foundation, institute, on some level owes its funding to poultry. The reason I say this is that the guy who founded them all, the guy who particularly funded the Atlas Foundation, which funds them on 5 continents, was a man called Anthony Fisher. Anthony Fisher was a demobbed RAF officer, and he found a copy of Hayek's Road to Serfdom. The legend has it on a train. I'm not sure whether that bit is true, but what is certainly true is he was so impressed, it totally changed his life. He went to see Hayek, who was then implausibly enough a professor at the London School of Economics. So difficult to imagine that today. And he said, "Professor, I've read your book. It's opened my eyes. I'm going to go into politics and change the world. May I have your benediction?" kind of thing. And Hayek said, "Don't be an idiot. Any fool can go into politics," which I can confirm from first-hand experiences, I'm afraid, absolutely 100% true. He said, "You have a much greater ability, which is to make the money. Go and make the money, and then you will endow something I've just invented called the think tank," which is basically what Fisher did. And how did he make his money? In broiler chickens. And this is the really cool thing, Dominic. I just think this is an underappreciated but rather heartwarming fact. Until the 1940s, chicken meat was basically a byproduct. So chickens were raised for eggs, and meat was a byproduct. It was the spare male chickens, or occasionally end-of-life hens, right? The breakthrough was saying, why don't we breed birds specifically to be eaten? This was the invention of the broiler chicken. Not a very nice name, right? When you're old enough to understand that you're a broiler chicken, is probably kind of a bit of a downer. Nonetheless, what an incredible moment, because for the first time in human history, ordinary people could afford protein. And it was an utterly, utterly revolutionary thing. We forget how recently meat was the preserve of the well-off. Even in your country, the richest country on the planet, the Hoover Republicans were promising a chicken in every pot in 1928. Right? So why the symbol for the liberty movement? A, because it's directly involved in funding it, but B, because it's the neatest possible symbol of how capitalism works for the little guy. That it's the opposite of trickle down. It's trickle up. Lots and lots of people who up until then couldn't have dreamt of it were prepared to pay small amounts of money to eat meat, and it hugely improved the utility and happiness of the human race. So for that reason, the chicken, unpromising and unpropitious as it seems, ugly, stupid bird, I know this, I grew up around them, mean little reptilian eyes, it is not a handsome bird, is nonetheless an almost perfect symbol of the liberty movement because it symbolizes how markets disperse wealth to the masses.
I think a lot of people don't fully grasp what that campaign promise that you mentioned from Herbert Hoover really meant, because a lot of Americans might be familiar with that expression, his promise for chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. And at that time, the car in every garage and the chicken, I mean, today we look at those and we say, well, those are like completely different. I mean, a car is so expensive and chicken is so cheap. But at that time, people were genuinely having a difficult time affording chicken. And, you know, we have food inflation today. There's lots of problems today. But this is a difference not in price levels or in, you know, monetary policy causing some inflation in the economy. This is a huge difference in the way that chickens were bred, as you mentioned, and the way that they were marketed and sold. And so what was it that, about what time did chicken become popular and common for ordinary people to afford? And what was it that actually made the difference in order to make that possible?
What made the difference was effectively industrialization, right? And I'm not going to shy away from this. It was in its early stages pretty nasty for the chickens, right? The early phase of broiler farming, which is from the middle years of the 20th century, involved practices that we now recoil at. But the impact of that was this extraordinary spread of wealth, and we've now got to the point where we can outlaw and eliminate the cruelty or the worst aspects of the cruelty while still having cheaper than ever protein, which is an extraordinary thing, right? Put it like this: possession of a hen turns a pauper into an entrepreneur, right? It's a kind of intrinsically capitalist bird. I think Bill Gates had this program to try and spread chickens through Africa. And he said, you know, if you own a dozen hens, there are several countries, and I forget the number, but there's 20-something countries in Africa where owning a dozen hens and selling the eggs and rearing the chicks will give you an income above the average income in that country, right? I mean, isn't that just fantastic? Imagine if governments had tried to do that. Imagine, well, we don't need to imagine. We've seen the international community step in and try and solve poverty in Africa with state schemes. None of it as effective as giving people ownership rights and the ability to buy and sell freely.
And that property rights point is really key, because that is what keeps this process going, right? If you have an ownership stake in a chicken or a group of chickens, then you have the ability, or you have the incentive as the owner of that, to make sure that those chickens are healthy, to make sure that they stay alive, to make sure that they grow to be a proper age, to make sure they reproduce and make more chickens, because that means more income for you, but it also means more food for the community. And so that property right gives you the right incentives in order to keep that process moving.
Right. So you as the farmer are obedient to that basic Aristotelian precept that which nobody owns, nobody will care for. So you're going to make damn sure that nobody steals your chickens, nobody damages them, and as you say, they remain fertile and productive. But that same dynamic is true even when you look at large-scale farming, right? Everyone has an incentive to make things better and to do so in their own interest by serving everyone around them. At this point, Dominic, I should declare an interest. My late father bred poultry in South America, among other things. He was a farmer, and his particular niche in the market was what they call nucleus stock. So he would breed the genetically most potent chickens and then sell them to be the kind of grandparents or great grandparents of the ones that would be used on the farm. And I maybe I'm biased. I have a certain amount of kind of filial pride, but I remember really throughout my life, a lot of times people would come to Peru, particularly Americans, would say, wow, the chicken here is so good. I've even eaten a KFC and it's never tasted so good, because it tasted better. And I like to think it was because they were bred better and they tasted better. By the way, really weird to eat at KFC if you are in Lima, which is the gastronomic capital of the world, but we'll leave that to one side. The point is, people in business don't wake up thinking, how can I screw my customers and make a little bit of extra on the side? Because that's a really bad business strategy, right? People, in whether they're in commerce, industry, whatever, farming, their first thought is, how do I delight my customers? How do I offer something better, right? And that may sound such an obvious point, and I'm sure the people who listen to your podcast are thinking, what a kind of basic bromide. Why tell us that? Well, next time you're arguing with a lefty friend, listen to how much conceptual difficulty they have with that. Listen to how they talk about greedy corporations and, price rises are because of greed rather than because of supply and demand and so on. It's central to the view of an awful lot of human beings that somehow we lose our virtues the moment we start working in a private company. And we become completely motivated by wanting to kind of grind every penny out of everyone else. Weirdly, the same people argue that if you work for the government, you somehow become, disinterested, wise, and selfless. Let's leave aside how they map that onto reality. It can't be stressed too often. The market is the way that connects you to other people. It makes you think yourself into your customers' shoes. It makes you empathetic. It makes you think, what does this guy want? Can I make this taste better? Can I do it so that it's cheaper? Can I get it to his front door more easily? Whatever it is. Ours is the only system, market capitalism, that rewards you for rewarding people around you. And I think that the chicken is the neatest example of that there is.
And the remarkable thing about it as well is that while this, of course, was a beneficial factor for citizens of wealthy countries, citizens of citizens with market economies, this innovation has spread truly across the entire world, even to countries with socialist governments, even to countries with lots of other problems. This same basic principle of property rights, ownership, and trade between voluntary exchange between individuals has been able to lift people out of poverty around the world, even in countries that might not have great governments or great systems like this.
Yeah, isn't that, by the way, the most cheerful finding, right? That to have improvements in productivity, you generally need to have secure property rights, including secure intellectual property rights, right? You have to have a climate where people will want to innovate and invest because they know that they will get to reap the benefits. But even as you say, if you live in a country that lacks those advantages, as long as the rest of the world is getting more productive, some of that is still going to spill over into your country, And this, again, is one of those slightly counterintuitive ideas, an idea that a lot of people struggle with. They say, and you particularly see it when there's a conversation about trade. People will say, look, the Chinese or whoever used to be the Japanese, whoever the bogeyman of the moment, we can't trade with them because they are, they pay slave wages and they steal our technology and they're super efficient and we can't compete with them and we've got to protect our producers and all this. But there's a counterintuitive but very basic conceptual error there. If somebody else is improving their productivity, they can't do it without incidentally enriching the people around them, right? You can illustrate this in a way by saying, all right, maybe you and I as writers have obvious productivity gains that we wouldn't have had in Shakespeare's time, right? We can type and call up information that the entire world wouldn't have had in the time of the bard. So you can see how our productivity has improved. You can see why we're living better. But what if you're, say, a barmaid, right? Your productivity is basically not improved since the tavern wench of Shakespeare's time, right? I mean, okay, you may have got a dishwasher now, so you can But basically, your job is what it would have been, 400 and whatever years ago. You ask people what they want to drink and you pour a glass, right? But look at how much better the barmaid is living than in Shakespeare's time. She doesn't have pox. She's likely to survive childbirth. She's literate. She's not only literate, but she too has all the world's information in her palm. She has opportunities to travel intellectually and physically that would have been unimaginable, not because her productivity has improved one whit, but because she's benefiting from improvements in the productivity of people who've been in medicine, engineering, agriculture, whatever. Right? And it's the same for whole countries. When the rest of the world gets richer, we all do better.
And this is especially true when the productivity that is improving and the improvements that are following from that as knock-on effects are related to nutrition. Because in lots of the world, not that long ago, very severe poverty meant starvation. And it still does in some areas, but far less than it did even 20 to 30 years ago, let alone, 500 years ago. And so between crops that we can grow more efficiently with higher yields, whether that be rice or grain, but also, as you say, with protein. And chicken is a huge part of how we were able to get to that situation where now global starvation as a consequence of global poverty is just nowhere near the problem that it used to be.
It's effectively disappeared, other than, the last place that still suffers man-made famines is North Korea, because it's the one place that has completely stayed outside global markets and has elevated the principle of self-sufficiency of Juche to the ruling principle of government. Everywhere else, countries finally got it through their heads that the way to have security, whether of food or of anything else, was not to try and produce it all yourself, but to buy from the widest possible diversity of suppliers so that you were not vulnerable to a local shock or disruption, which might as easily happen on your own territory as anywhere else. And in a way, the chicken again is the supreme symbol of this, right? There's at the very beginning of Yuval Harari's book *Sapiens*, he begins by showing how much more biomass is taken up by chickens than by all birds put together, right? And he's very disapproving of this, partly on kind of animal cruelty grounds, and partly because he thinks we've kind of distorted our environment. And the animal cruelty thing, I'll give him elements of that, right? I'm not going to sugarcoat that. It's improving, but I would not want to be reincarnated as a chicken. However, the tech is eventually going to eliminate that. We're seeing these amazing improvements in what they call clean meat. The farmers call it lab-grown meat or petri dish meat, but it's actually going to be eventually produced in factories. And it's actual meat, right? It's not meat substitute. It's as if you could grow the chicken breast without the head or the feathers or the feet. It's only a matter of time before that becomes cheaper than the alternative. So as long as you have the freedom to innovate, but in the meantime, if you think of how, I suspect that those earliest hunter-gatherers, in their dim sort of recesses of imagination, would have thought, wouldn't it be great if there were really slow-moving birds that were effectively flightless and that we could just scoop up and eat when we wanted? Well, here they are. And so, of course, they've spread out and their biomass has overtaken that of wild birds because they are so incredibly useful to us. And the flip side, I'm not saying that the Yuval Harari view is without merit. That there are, we need to be aware of environmental consequences. We need to be aware of animal welfare. But as tech improves, we're going to be able to produce more and more food, not only with less cruelty, but with less space. More and more of our planet is going to be rewilded. But in the meantime, look at what we have done for human wealth and happiness. The most basic need that tortured our ancestors for tens of thousands of years. Am I going to get enough to eat? Most languages not ours, but a great many languages, especially of more primitive peoples, have a specific word for meat hunger. You know, it's a recognized part of our physiognomy. That need has been eliminated. You know, we've done what those Stone Age ancestors of ours would have assumed was a power that only gods could wield. And what was the magic formula that unleashed that extraordinary divine potency? The free market, allowing ideas to be in the cloud, allowing supply lines to extend, allowing people to make free choices.
And thank goodness for that. And thank you for being with us today, Dan. This was a great conversation.
Thanks so much, Dominic. Keep up the good work.
How do we know we live in a market economy? There are obviously lots of ways that government interferes in the economy that do not align with market economics. The U.S. has a tariff schedule over 4,000 pages long. The healthcare and housing sectors have government involvement around every corner. Any major construction project gets tangled in years of red tape and lawsuits. But how do I know that we still live in a market economy despite all the interference? Well, one example, this week's news that the U.S. has set the record for most oil production in 1 year in human history in 2023. The U.S. broke its own record from 2019. The U.S. has produced more oil than any other single country each year since 2018. It extended its lead above Saudi Arabia and Russia last year. And the record is safe because no other country currently even has enough capacity to break it. This record comes despite the Biden administration's hostility to the oil industry. Biden has repeatedly promised to tax the industry more. His administration has actually implemented lots of regulations and slowed or blocked approval processes for new projects. His political party regularly makes big oil out to be the most fiendish villain in the U.S. economy. Yet, the sector is thriving. Perhaps oil production would be even higher if Biden was not president. But during this same period of time, many other countries have been cutting production in response to market prices. Oil is one of the most globally traded commodities, and price signals operate in the oil market pretty well. That's especially the case now that OPEC has been weakened by greater U.S. production and elsewhere outside of that cartel's membership. One thing the government did helped this boom in production, and it was getting out of the way. Until 2015, U.S. crude oil exports were prohibited by law. When a GOP Congress and a Democratic administration worked together to repeal that export ban, U.S. oil companies suddenly had a much bigger market to work with. That further helped to weaken OPEC by providing market competition on a global scale. Another thing that helped was the invention of fracking. This new oil extraction technique faced significant opposition from activists, but government for the most part let it happen. More than 10 years after fracking became relatively common, we now know that the doomsday predictions of poisoned drinking water and decimated landscapes have not occurred, and oil production is greater than ever before. The success of the oil industry, despite the Biden administration's displeasure, is the mirror image of the success of the tech industry, despite the Trump administration's displeasure. Trump's dislike of the tech companies is no secret, and he has spoken out numerous times about his personal hatred for Mark Zuckerberg. Yet, if you put $1,000 into Facebook stock on the day Trump was inaugurated, it would have been worth about $2,000 on the day he left office. If you can double your money investing in a company that the president hates, that's a good sign you live in a market economy. In a non-market economy, political favoritism matters more than economic results. If you're out of favor with the governing party, you're going out of business. Now, there are, of course, plenty of problems with political favoritism in the U.S. economy. But it is still true that two of the country's largest industries, tech, and energy, were hated by each of the past two presidential administrations, yet they continue to thrive. That is a good sign for the future. Now, in the present, inflation remains a problem in the US. It's not as bad as it was. The year-over-year rate in the Consumer Price Index, the most common inflation measure, peaked in June 2022 at 9%. The most recent report, released just this week for the month of February, showed inflation at 3.2%. That's a big decline, but it's not enough. The Federal Reserve, and specifically the Federal Open Market Committee, controls monetary policy in the United States. It has set an inflation target of 2% in the long run. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell has been very clear that that remains the target, and that the Fed will do whatever it takes to get back to 2%. The Fed believes it is on the right path to do that right now, and it has held interest rates steady at its last several meetings. The Fed raised interest rates in response to inflation. The simplest explanation of inflation is too much money chasing after too few goods. The simplest explanation of raising interest rates is to raise the price of money. If you want to turn too much money into less money, raising the price of money is one way to do that. In that sense, money is just like any other good. The Fed doesn't have any control over the too few goods part of the equation, though. It can only control the money supply, and it even does that imperfectly. The effects of its monetary policy changes show up in the real economy with long and variable lags. But for right now, inflation is stuck between 3 and 4%. It has been in that window since June of 2023. Again, that's a lot better than 9%. But it's still far from the Fed's long-term goal of 2%. The difference between 2% and 3 or 4% might seem trivial, but it is not. First, inflation is cumulative, and an extra point or two per year can add up fast. 4% inflation is double 2% inflation, even though the difference is only 2 percentage points. It's sort of the evil twin of the fact that 3% economic growth is so much better than 2% economic growth. From the Fed's point of view, though, 2% inflation is much better than 3 or 4% because the Fed has staked its credibility on getting back to 2%. Jerome Powell has been unequivocal on this issue. He has faced some pressure from some economists to essentially declare victory over inflation by just raising the inflation target to 3%. We did it. But he has resisted that pressure and made it very clear that he believes 2% is the goal. The Fed chairman's word is very important. Powell is, in this case, simply following the Fed's stated monetary policy of a 2% long-run inflation target. Really, the Fed should be aiming to get inflation below 2% for a period of time to compensate for the misses above the target in the past 2 years. But getting back to 2% is a must. If the Fed fails to do that, it will lose credibility for its primary purpose as an institution, keeping inflation low and stable. We've seen what an uncredible Fed looks like in the past. The 1970s saw high and volatile inflation, in part because the Fed was unable to credibly commit to its monetary policy. That changed with the appointment of Paul Volcker as Fed chairman in 1979. He committed the Fed to reducing inflation, come hell or high water. And that opposition did come. He was attacked by politicians and by various interest groups for the astronomically high interest rates that the Fed implemented at the start of his term. But Volcker was unfazed, smoking his pipe in congressional hearings as politicians lit into him. As a result, U.S. inflation declined to around 2% and basically stayed there until COVID. The Fed was able to do this because it was independent of politicians. Politicians, you see, they always want easy money or low interest rates. And they especially want low interest rates in election years. The overall economy does not really care whether it is an election year or not, and sometimes higher rates in an election year will be warranted. But politicians seeking to get reelected really do care about election years. One of the top historical examples of this was during the administration of Richard Nixon. Nixon, rather infamously, went to any extent to help his reelection chances. Aside from the Watergate scandal, Nixon pressured Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns to goose the economy with expansionary monetary policy in the lead-up to the 1972 election. We know from Nixon's own writings that he believed poor economic conditions cost him the 1960 presidential election, which he narrowly lost to John F. Kennedy. Nixon returned to win the presidency in 1968 and then faced re-election in 1972. A 2006 paper by Burton Abrams compiles evidence from the Nixon tapes about Nixon's efforts to pressure Burns on monetary policy. It was evident, both from things that Nixon said to Burns directly and from things that he said to his budget director and close advisor, George Shultz, that Nixon wanted easier money before the election. He related this request directly to his prospects of re-election, and he likely appointed Burns to the job of Fed chairman, in part because of Burns' record as a loyal Republican. Sure enough, monetary policy did ease up in the year leading up to the 1972 election, and Nixon won. Now, Nixon likely would have won anyway, and it's possible that Burns reached his conclusion about the need for an expansionary policy independently. But as Abrams points out in the paper, Burns was a very accomplished economist who knew better than to institute easy money during an economic expansion. His own academic writing contradicted it. Well, we know how it turned out. Abrams wrote, "Regardless of the ultimate source of Arthur Burns' motivation, his actions as Federal Reserve Chair helped to trigger an extremely costly inflationary boom-bust cycle. By Election Day in 1972, the Fed had already started its monetary tightening. The federal funds rate had risen from 4.49% in July of 1972 to 5.06% on Election Day. As Nixon told Burns in February 1972, I really don't care what you do after April. 1 year after the election, in November 1973, the Federal Reserve had hit the monetary policy brakes in earnest. Now, every Fed chair since Arthur Burns has one rule above all else. Don't become Arthur Burns. In the decades since, the Fed has rightly prized its independence from politicians. And until COVID, the results on inflation were pretty good. Economists call the roughly 40 years from the early 1980s until 2020 the Great Moderation, when inflation hung around 2% per year. There were plenty of other economic problems during that time span, but inflation was not one of them. Now it has snuck back in. Part of the reason is that the Fed was too slow to adjust its monetary policy when inflation started after the pandemic recession. Nobody is saying the Fed is perfect. In recent years, it has focused too much attention on areas in which it has little to no direct control, such as climate change or racial equality, and neglected the one area where it has a lot of control, the money supply. The Fed also failed as a financial regulator during the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank last year. But whatever problems the Fed has, and there are many, they would all be worse if it was controlled by politicians. We know that from the history of Burns and Nixon, and we know it from evidence in other countries around the world. Now, one of the areas that Joe Biden has been good on is respecting the Fed's independence. He reappointed Jerome Powell as chairman despite opposition to Powell from within the president's own party. And he has mostly refrained from attacking the Fed as president. That's something you can't say about Donald Trump, who as president suggested that Powell, whom he appointed as chairman in the first place, is a bigger enemy to America than Xi Jinping. Big U.S. growth if he does the right thing. Big cut, Trump tweeted in August 2019. An opportune time to cut rates and have them take effect in the economy before the 2020 election. Straight from the Nixon playbook. But expect the temptation to increase for Biden as the 2024 election nears. He is already slipping, telling a crowd on March 8th, I can't guarantee it, but I bet you those rates come down more because I bet you that little outfit that sets interest rates, it's going to come down. Now, the Fed will not only face pressure from politicians. Wall Street also wants interest rates to come down. Markets are still predicting rate cuts later this year before the elections in November. But if inflation is still stuck between 3 and 4%, those cuts are going to have to wait. A central bank's independence and a central bank's credibility is a terrible thing to waste, and it's very hard to regain once it's lost. Now it's time for the paper of the episode. But before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show. It makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. The paper of the episode will be a recurring segment at the end of every eConception episode, where we highlight an economics paper that's worth knowing about. There are so many important papers that have shaped the discipline, and the best ones have one key idea, and for that reason can be summarized in a few minutes at the end of a podcast. This one directly relates to politicians and monetary policy. From the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking in 1993 by Alberto Alesina and Larry Summers. Central Bank Independence and Macroeconomic Performance, Some Comparative Evidence. In this paper, Alesina and Summers do a very simple comparison. They plot how independent a central bank is from politicians against the average inflation rate for several different countries. They find a relatively strong negative relationship, meaning that countries with more independent central banks have lower average inflation. They then compare the level of central bank independence against average economic growth. There, they find no relationship. This is great news. It means that central banks independent from politicians actually are better at keeping inflation low than ones that depend on politicians. And it means that economic growth is explained by other factors, not related to central bank independence. We know from countries around the world that going from a politician-influenced central bank to an independent central bank can get inflation under control no matter what the rest of the economy looks like. Central Bank Independence and Macroeconomic Performance, Some Comparative Evidence from Alesina and Summers. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.